afternoon. I'll call this meeting to order. Please join me for the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay. Thank you, and let's move on to public comments. Mr. Doyle, do we have any?
We do not, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. Then we'll move on to the approval of the minutes from the November 15th board meeting. If there are no objections to approval, they are approved. And we are now ready for this superintendent's report. Mr. Ragsdale.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chair, members of the board. I'm going to ask Mr. Brad Johnson to come forward and bring the first quarter financial report. I will remind the board that it was due last month, but Brad had some unexpected eye difficulties, is the way I will phrase it, but it was much more severe. So we're great to have him with us, glad to have him with us, and glad that everything's on the mend. Brad.
Thank you, Mr. Superintendent. I'm going to try to go slow here for a little bit, but this is the financial report for the first quarter of FY 2019. This report reflects financial data for the 3-month period ending September 30th, 2018. I will briefly cover some highlights for the first 4 sections of the report, which are finance, cash management, school food services, and capital projects. The remaining data at the end of the report is presented for informational purposes only and identifies payments and budget adjustments greater than $100,000. And then always, this report will be posted on the website to enable the public to review it. For today, I have placed a copy of the presentation at your desk, and you can follow along with this hard copy. You also have a complete first quarter financial report. It's a black cover book at your desk here today that you can refer to during the presentation if you want to, or later at your leisure. So I'll start with the first page in the presentation, and it's the first page, I guess it's your third page in your handout. It's the page with the pie charts. This first page displays revenue and expenditure data for the general fund, which is the district's primary and largest fund. On this chart, you'll notice that 25% of the fiscal year has elapsed as of September 30th, and at that time we had collected 24% of total budgeted revenues and expended or encumbered 25% of the expense budget. A broad view of general fund financial performance indicates that our revenue collections are similar to previous years, and our expenditures for the current year continue to be tight as in our previous years. For revenue specifically, we collected 24% of revenues in the first quarter compared to 24% in the first quarter of the previous year, so we're tracking very similar. A review of expenditures show that we spent 25% of the budget in the first quarter this year compared to 24.4% last year. This means that our budget is still very tightly controlled, but from a percentage standpoint, our estimates are right on target, but also with limited room for estimating error. As I previously stated when the board approved the budget last year, our numbers are estimated in a tight range, and we must monitor the budget versus actual for revenues and expenditures very carefully as we proceed through the remainder of the fiscal year. But this has been our standard operating procedure for several years. Our estimates are purposely tight so that the district can maximize the money available for our students and our classrooms and our instruction. If you would turn to the next slide, please. This next slide is a summary of revenues and expenditures as of September 30th by category. The format of the report are that there are 2 sections down the left side of the report entitled Revenue and Expenditures. Across the top, there are multiple columns for original budget, revised budget, year-to-date actual expenditures, encumbrances, and then several metrics on the right side for over and under budget and percent differences. In the first column, we begin showing that the original budget is $1.069 billion in revenue, and $1.077 billion in expenditure appropriations, resulting in a board-approved budgeted use of $7.8 million in fund balance. Next, please look at the first category titled Revenue. We begin with the original budget of $1.069 billion, and then we had a budget revision for additional property digest growth when the board approved the property digest growth from 6% growth to 8.21% earlier this fiscal year. Actual revenue collected in the first quarter was $256 million, which results in 24% of our revenue collected in 1/4 of the way through the fiscal year. As you will know, in every year, we collect most of our property tax revenue in the second quarter of the fiscal year. Property taxes are due on October 15th. So when you see a summary of revenue next quarter in the second quarter, you'll see a much larger total of revenue recorded for the general fund. Next, look at the second category titled Expenditures. We begin with an original budget of $1.077 billion in the first column. In the second column, we show board-approved revisions to the expenditure budget. These changes revised the expenditure budget to $1.009 billion. Actual expenditures of $264 million, coupled with encumbrances, results in the district having spent 25% of the budget 1/4 of the way through the fiscal year. Next slide, please. The next slide is the presentation is cash management. As you can see on the slide, we have earned $1,290,470 this year in interest in all funds for the first 3 months ended September 30th. And this is compared to $486,000 last year at the same time. So you can see that interest rates are starting to rise. The weighted average rate of return as of September 30th was 1.97%, which is roughly the same as the rate of a 3-month Treasury bill. Although interest rates have been increasing, interest rates are still historically low and have been for quite some time now, and we will continue to monitor and invest funds at the highest possible rate. Our accounting department continues to be diligent to invest all idle funds at the highest possible rates. And additionally, despite the low rates, our financial advisor, PFM Financial Advisors, is available for us to consult with and assist us with investment options should we choose to ask them, ensuring that our investments are safe. Next slide, please. The next slide of the presentation that I want to present is the school food service report. This report shows meal-related activity at each school for both the current month and the fiscal year to date. For the FY 2019 overall in the first quarter, elementary school shows a year-to-date loss of $959,000. Middle schools show a loss of $168,000. High schools have a profit of $15,000. And finally, the other section shows a profit of $340,000. All of these combined show a total program loss of $772,501.50. Please note that it is not unusual for food service programs to start off the year with a loss due to the fact that the fund has to pay for July and August salaries as well as salary increases before the new school year cafeteria sales begin coming in. So eventually, during the fiscal year, the program will be profitable. Next slide, please. The last section of the quarterly report is the SPLOS and capital projects section. And in the black book, this information reflects revenue and expenditures in the capital project funds. These funds include SPLOS 3, 4, and the countywide building fund. As always, we monitor SPLOS revenue collections on a monthly basis and report this revenue in the quarterly financial report. Our current SPLOS program is SPLOS 4, and this is the last slide that we're presenting here on the screen, and it presents the revenue collection status for this program. SPLOS 4 actual calendar year 2018 sales tax collections for the 9 months calendar year beginning January were $105.6 million, which is 4.1% ahead of last year's actual, and that's a good thing. It's 10.3% below previous projections. This increase in actual collections does reflect an improving economy. Inception to date, SPLOST 4 actual sales tax are $609.6 million compared to projections of $664 million, which is 10.3% under budget compared to projections. Some comments regarding these revenue collections. The district is continuing to monitor SPLOST revenues to identify trends in sales tax collections. The state of Georgia economy continues to improve, which might assist in closing this year's budget variance. Major projects such as the new Brave Stadium and the Battery are providing additional sales tax revenue during the out years of the current SPLOST program and definitely into the SPLOST 5 program coming up. And it is anticipated that the district could collect dollars in state construction funding that could possibly assist in the district capital building programs. So, Mr. Chair, this concludes the presentation of the quarterly financial report for the first quarter of fiscal year 2019. We're tracking exactly compared to previous years. I feel good about where we are financially, and I'm available to answer questions.
Anybody got questions? Mr. Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's good to see you, Mr. Johnson.
Good to see you.
One of the things I think, and you've mentioned this before, but just for the viewing audience, we talked about one of the reasons for perhaps the miss on those projections having to do with the way that the car tags were valued and so forth. Can you just hit on that briefly?
Well, car tags used to be collected, and it was based on the birthday taxes. Now it's a title fee, and so it doesn't go into that same category as it used to. So we're collecting the money, but it's just collected in a different way.
And my point is that when the SPLOST notebook and the forecast was originally put together, the laws were changed after that was done, and that kind of modified their projections.
You're exactly correct.
Okay.
Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To follow up on that a little bit, I believe we approved $717 million in SPLOST 4. Is that correct? Was that the number originally without with the car tax?
717, yes, sir.
Okay, and so by taking the car tax out, we came down to $664 million for the 5-year period.
Right.
Okay. So we got 3 more months. Let's say at 12,000, we got say $36 million more coming in the next 3 months. So that'll put us about 645. So we're going to come in about 20 million, close to 20 million, $20 million short. But December could be a very good month because of Christmas.
We're actually starting to approach the figures, and sales tax in the last quarter of any calendar year should be a bigger year.
Okay, so it may be possibly $15 to $16 million short, even after the car tax has been taken out. So we did not collect this year, or the 5-year period, all the money that could have been collected if the sales had been at the projected amount.
Right.
Which means there are some projects that are not going to get done during the SPLOST 4 period. Let me go back to the financial P&L for the quarter, and I noticed you stated, I believe we had $9 million in additional property tax growth. And then we used $9 million of that for our sales, for our raises for employees. So that kind of washed out. That was a washout.
It was a wash because when we realized the additional property digest growth, The additional money was put towards the raise, and the raise was increased from 1.1% to 2.6%.
Okay, in the pro forma statement you gave us back in October, I think we showed about close to $10 million growth in our fund balance. So we're taking out of that fund balance 7.8 in order to balance this budget, this coming. Well, is it this year's budget or last year?
This, the 7.8 is in the current fiscal year budget.
Okay. So actually, we actually have grown the fund balance regardless of the 7.8. Is that correct?
The fund balance has grown slightly, but, you know, it just depends on the, how revenues and expenditures are occurred. And so, as I've referenced to y'all many times, if I'm off just 1% of my projections, if I'm off by 1% for revenue and expenditures, it could be as much as $22 or $23 million off. So, yeah, we grew the fund balance a little bit, but in terms of percentages, you know, that sounds like a lot of money, but in terms of percentages on a $1 billion budget, in fact, it's almost a $1.1 billion budget. That's a very small percentage to be off. And we were off, but at least we were off to the good.
Okay, now the $9 million that we adjusted the budget by as a result of property tax evaluations going up, was that based on the 6% or the 8%?
In the budget that the board approved in May, that was based on a 6% digest growth. And that enabled us to have a 1.1% raise. But when we realized at the end of June, after you had approved the budget, that the digest was going to grow more than we thought, we used all that additional revenue to increase the raise. So it was a wash. We put it into revenue, but we spent it in expenditures.
Right. Have you had any conversations with the tax assessors or the tax commissioner about the coming fiscal year budget for next year, about what kind of growth we might be anticipating?
It's very early in the year. We get an estimate coming up in March. So, you know, 3 months from now, we may get somewhat of an idea. I still think when we prepare the budget that we need to be conservative. And it may come in more, but, you know, if we stayed with the current growth, that would probably be a conservative estimate. I don't want to overestimate it, because then if it came in at the end and it went down, then I'd have to come back to the superintendent and the board and say, hey, we might have to cut the budget, and we really don't want to do that.
Okay. Let me ask you about, you know, we've had several companies come to us and explain their projections or their projects that they're anticipating establishing in Cobb County, which affects our tax base. Do we track these pilots that are being implemented to see, you know, make sure they're doing what they should do as far as the amount of money? Do we track it?
The tax assessor tracks it in a very detailed way. They know what the properties are worth. They know what's excluded from the property digest. They know what's abated in the property digest. They also know that if it's a 10-year abatement, how much is 1/10 of each abatement going forward. So we can get all the data we need.
Okay, so they're controlling the pilot revenue.
Pardon me?
They're controlling the pilot revenue.
Yeah, we will get, we never lose on these projects when they present to the board. We're going to get the same amount that we would have gotten had no projects ever been done. And so some people call it a payment in lieu of taxes.
Right.
But as part of those deals, the district is guaranteed not to lose, and we get that money going forward.
Right.
And in the long run, we'll get more, because that property will be redeveloped, and eventually it'll be worth more. And after all the abatements, we'll be collecting a lot more property taxes, especially over a 10-year abatement. After that, it'll be worth a lot more.
Yeah. Also, I think most everybody knows about the sales tax, that now the Supreme Court says that everybody has to, no matter where you live, a company that sells something to somebody in Georgia, they have to collect the sales tax. Have we explored how we can verify that we're getting all the tax monies that we should be getting?
I've already had some conversation with the superintendent, and we're planning on having a conversation with the Department of Revenue. Previously, that the Georgia, you couldn't collect sales tax if they didn't have a physical presence in the state. But now the Supreme Court recently had a decision, and I'm getting a little bit out of my lane here, but in the article I read, I think it was South Dakota or someplace, where that's not the case anymore. And so now I've actually gotten some emails from vendors to say, hey, we got to start collecting sales tax. And that's something that's new for me. So I'm wondering how that will impact our sales tax collections going forward. Probably a lot of the big vendors already remit sales taxes, but if we can determine how we can track all these other people that are supposed to pay it, especially as a result of this new ruling, and there was a new Georgia law approved too last spring. So that's something I plan on checking into, and we plan on going down and meet with the Department of Revenue just to see what it is. And an article I read that if Georgia implements it, it could collect as much as $600 million statewide as a result of that. What is our portion of that? I don't know.
Do we have any way of knowing, like say, for instance, Amazon collects sales tax? Do we have any way of determining how much that was or is? Who actually gets the money? Does the state revenue department get the money and then allocate it to us based on our whatever rate we should be getting or wherever we're sold to?
Right, we're dealing with the Department of Revenue, and it's a process that I don't clearly understand all the ins and outs of it and how they do it. What does their system look like? What capabilities does their system have to track people? You know, are they doing it when they should, and do they know if somebody's not? And so that's where I want to go down and discuss with them to see how it works and what we can help them do about it.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Banks. Anyone else? Mr. Scamahorn?
Thank you. I didn't have a question until I was glancing at the SPLOST 3 tab.
Okay.
And am I reading that right on the last page that we have uncommitted $737, almost $738,000 in SPLOST 3 funds? It's on page 10 of 10 of that tab, SPLOST 3.
I'm sorry, Mr. Scamahorn, I'm having a hard time seeing anything here. There might be some uncommitted balances there, but one thing too that's one of the major projects left in SPLOST 3 is the Munis financial system that we're working on. And so that's something I haven't reported to the board lately, but we're deeply into that project, and we're due to go live in July 1 with the new system. And so that's one of the main big remaining projects in SPLOST 3 before we close out that program. And if specifically of a number, maybe I can get with you later and I can kind of explain whatever number it is here.
That's what I was going to suggest when you get feeling a little better.
Okay.
If you can kind of, I'll sit down with you if that's what you prefer, or you can let the board know what we're doing with that.
And I may need to get with SPLOST too to understand what their plans are for it, because sometimes they have plans and it's just not recorded yet. So.
Okay. All right, we'll leave it at that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Scamahorn. No other questions. We have board agenda items. Mr. Ragsdale.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chair, members of the board. Board agenda item number 1 is the monthly reoccurring item for authorization of school properties disposal, and that list has been sent to you electronically. Be happy to answer any questions.
Is sent without objection.
All right, agenda item number 2, I'm going to ask Mr. Adams to come and bring this agenda on.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Superintendent, Mr. Chair, members of the board. It is good to have Brad Johnson back. In addition to having the second best haircut in the central office, he is still better with limited vision than any 2 CFOs put together. Pleased to bring you agenda item number 2, recommendation for approval of architect appointment for Sprayberry High School renovations and gymnasium addition. As usual, in accordance with our board rules governing fee schedules for architectural and engineering services, we are going to recommend the appointment of an architect for the Sprayberry project in order to maintain our anticipated timeline and is funded by SPLOST 5. We're recommending that the architectural award go to CDH Partners out of Marietta, Georgia. They've done some similar work for us successfully in the past. You see the cost listed there, $925,162. This will be paid by the general fund, but then the costs will be reimbursed to the general fund by SPLOST 5. And I'm available for any questions.
Questions? Mr. Banks?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At one time, we had discussed where that new gym would be. Let's see, it's a gym, it's just a renovation of the gym, but it's going to be in a different location, if I understand it, where the old gym was. Is that still?
It's an additional gym.
It's additional?
It's a new gym. Yeah, it's an additional gym like the rest of the schools have been getting in
Okay,
SPLOST.
have we just, at one time, we were talking about putting it over on the west side of the school. Is that still the?
And
the
I
plan?
don't mean to sound flippant, but that's why we hire the architect.
Okay.
Because we have to hire the architect and get him or her in there to tell us exactly what we can do where. But without being an architect, I didn't even sleep in a Holiday Inn Express last night. I can't begin to speculate as to exactly where it would go. But we'll get you some information as soon as we get the architect on board.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Banks. Mr. Scamahorn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Couple things, Mr. Adams. Did I hear you say this gym and the theater was coming out of SPLOST 5?
It's budgeted in 5, but as noted, the cost will initially be paid for out of the general fund, and then the architectural cost will be reimbursed to general fund by 5.
Okay. And the reason why I'm asking, for some reason I thought it was 4, but in SPLOST 5, there's also a increasing our career, or rebuilding the career and tech wing, which we really haven't discussed as a board. But is that going to be also one of the things that they're going to consider on how to do that?
Yes, sir, that's an excellent point. Included in the notation about renovations, that does include the item for renovation of the CTAE wing, if you will. Yes, sir, this
Okay.
is included.
So, and without getting into the superintendent's business, are we looking at expanding that to possibly having the title of an academy, or what? Have the discussions gone that far yet?
No, sir, they have not. I can assure you, however, that our plan is to at least make sure that following the CTA renovations, that we have at least the same capacity that we currently have, and obviously be a better facility.
Based on, and again, I didn't even get to sleep in the Holiday Inn Express, but is there a possibility we'll need to move the baseball field?
I can't begin to speculate, because you are more familiar probably with the layout of Sprayberry than I am, but as soon as we get the architect on board, we could get y'all some more information about that potential.
Okay, and the thrust of my questions are this. Over the years, I've watched where we do major projects with a previous SPLOST, and then the next SPLOST, we come in and we tear half of that out to put in the newer SPLOST. And as you know, and we've had conversations, truth, be told is that's one of the things I watch for. I'm kind of over, tearing out SPLOST 3 and SPLOST 4 to do SPLOST 5, and I know, and that's not an accusation to our current folks. I know you and Nick Parker and your staff are are very keen on that. So I'll leave it at that and let you just kind of brief us in the future, if you would.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Scammahorn. Any other questions there?
Mr. Scammahorn, could you explain what you were talking about on that? Specific, because I'm not aware of any projects that we've torn down to rebuild.
Okay, well, I'll explain the 3 years I was at Sprayberry. When I first got there, we were putting in major additions and air conditioning and that. And the year I left to go to North Cobb, they were tearing most of that out for more
Which
stuff.
year was that?
And I'll also say, pardon?
Which year was that?
2001. Okay.
Okay, so that wasn't for SPLOST 4, or,
No, I didn't say, I said
Oh, okay.
previous SPLOSs.
okay.
But
Okay,
your
you mentioned
question's a good
SPLOST
one.
3 and 4, but you weren't talking about those.
No.
Okay, all right, I just
Okay.
wanted to clarify
Then
that.
also, you can go to J.J. Daniel, and on Splosh 2, they were tearing out some things there for Splosh 3. And then the other thing, and I don't know why God made me go through all of this, can I say God here? Okay. But when I got to North Cobb, they did the same thing. They were doing the same thing. They were tearing out substantial areas of previous SPLOSs for SPLOS, I think 3, yeah, then, I'm not, whatever. So I may not have my numbers on the SPLOS exactly right.
Yeah, I'd never heard of any of that.
So,
Okay.
well, my background's construction, technology, electronics engineering, so I'm very
Interesting.
keen on that. In fact, I can take you to North Cobb where the design should have been better. Okay, and the principal and
Interesting.
I were told to be quiet.
Interesting, thank you.
So, yeah. But anyway, I didn't anticipate all that, but I'm happy to share. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for me.
Any questions, is consent? Discussion. Item 3.
All right, agenda item number 3, Mr. Chair, members of the board, I'm going to ask Mr. Brad Johnson to come back up. As you will recall, I let the board know that this was going to be a standard operating procedure for SPLOST moving forward as the economy is turning around and interest rates are going back up now. This used to be the SOP for operations each year, but when the economy tanked, it became fiscally not prudent to go down this path. But getting the short-term construction note obviously allows us to get a jump start on projects during the year, each year, and then be allowed to pay that back with the SPLOST revenue. So again, the time frame is that we're bringing this to you in December, which will allow us to, and I know I'm probably taking some of your thunder, Brad, I apologize, but this will allow us to issue the bids or the bid for the notes, and then in January, the board will be asked to approve the lowest bid. And then it will go through the process, so we'll be able to get the money in early February by doing this schedule. Brad.
Thanks, sir. Mr. Chair, Mr. Vice Chair, members of the board, and Mr. Superintendent. Board agenda item number 3 is a recommendation for approval of short-term construction note resolution, which is a form of a TAN, approving the issuance of a request for bids for the purchase of $90 million of construction notes. As a result of the many district building projects and to mitigate rising construction costs in the metro Atlanta area, estimated to be in the range of 3 to 5%, the district has followed a standard operating procedure starting last year, and we had done that in previous years as well, to acquire annual short-term construction notes so that the district will have all of its SPLOST revenue funds for 2019 at the beginning of the calendar year, instead of our previous procedure of simply collecting the SPLOST revenue 1 month at a time during the calendar year. So with that said, let me talk about short-term construction notes and the various details that the board needs to be aware of. So what is a short-term construction note? Short-term construction note is a form of a tax anticipation note, a TAN, used for general fund purposes and property taxes. A short-term construction note is a short-term debt instrument for a calendar year that must be paid back in the calendar year in which it was borrowed. So we would borrow it in January and pay it back in December. These short-term notes would be repaid by the end of the calendar year using SPLOST revenue proceeds that will be collected each month during the calendar year next year. Short-term notes are not considered long-term debt. Short-term debt is a debt less than 1 year, while long-term debt is debt greater than 1 year. Why is the district considering a short-term construction note? Well, construction costs in Cobb County are estimated to increase by a range of 3 to 5% each year. That's significant when we talk about building buildings and facilities. By borrowing funds and starting projects at the beginning of a calendar year, it is estimated that construction projects could be considerably less expensive, resulting in substantial savings for the school district. In addition to savings on construction costs, the district can implement projects earlier in the calendar year. What is the short-term borrowing timeline? Well, there are several steps in a short-term borrowing. Step one, per Georgia law, we have to have the board or present to the board a resolution to say that we're going to market short-term notes, and then your approval will say that then we can go ahead and market those short-term notes to the U.S. financial market. So if you approve the resolution tonight, we'll work closely with our attorneys and our financial advisor to go ahead and market the notes, and we'll accept bids, and we'll present the winning bid on January 17th, 2019, after the first of the year. We expect, if the board does approve tonight and it approves the bids in January, then we would expect to receive the short-term proceeds at the end of January 2019. In order to secure the lowest borrowing costs for a short-term loan, the district has already engaged a credit rating agency, which is Moody's Investor Service, to get a short-term debt credit rating. This rating is different from our long-term AAA credit rating, in which we hold, in that their evaluation of the district will focus more on current assets and monthly cash flows, and short-term debt is assessed risk by the credit rating agency in much the same way that the long-term credit rating is assessed risk. The degree of risk is measured via its assigned credit rating of the district's short-term debt issuance. Moody's Investor Service classifies short-term notes into 4 credit rating grades, and they call it MIG, Municipal Investment Grade, MIG 1, MIG 2, MIG 3, and MIG 4. I do have good news for the board tonight, because yesterday we found out that based on the district's current financial status, and we've been working with Moody's now for a little while, but based on our current financial status and the district's current financial operations, on Wednesday, December 12th, Moody's Investor Service assigned the highest possible short-term credit rating, or a MIG 1, to the Cobb County School District. Obviously, that'll help us when we go get bids to get the best available rate. Additionally, as a result of engaging Moody's Investor Service for the short-term credit rating, Moody's has also reviewed the Cobb County School District's overall credit standing, and also on December 12th, they also reaffirmed our current AAA credit rating, which is the highest long-term credit rating possible. You might remember that 3 years ago, the district received the AAA credit rating designation for the first time in the school district's history. It's my pleasure to report to the board that the Financial Services Division has worked hard to maintain this financial standing. Very few organizations in the entire world maintain these type of credit ratings, and we hold both the highest short-term and the highest long-term. Now, what is the cost of a short-term note? What are the costs involved? Last year we borrowed $40 million, and we'll be repaying that note next week. This year we're proposing to borrow $90 million. I don't have exact numbers because we have to get bids in January, but let me try to describe the process for you. So we don't know the numbers exactly, but the short-term loan cost will be determined after we receive the bids in January. And additionally, the cost of the loan will definitely be mitigated by various factors involved in a competitive bid public sale. Number one, by doing a public sale, there is a wide universe of investors that will want this short-term loan, so we expect to get a great low rate. Number two, the district's Moody's AAA rating and short-term MIG-1 rating will make this loan attractive and cost competitive for investors. Number three, we're borrowing for a time period that is less than 12 calendar months, so that might mitigate interest cost during next year's calendar year. Number four, we can invest the funds that we borrowed during the year and make extra interest income will further mitigate the interest cost to the loan. And our current investment rate right now is 2.18%, which is the Georgia Fund 1 government investment pool. And then finally, by borrowing money at the beginning of the calendar year, we will be able to take advantage of lower construction costs, estimated, as I've already said, in the 3 to 5% growth rate. So all these things, I think that we'll have a net cost that will be something less than zero maybe, depending on how much we save in construction costs, if you take all the factors into consideration. We estimate that the interest rate based on the current market is somewhere in the range of 1.8 to 2.25%. We estimate right now that the Georgia Fund municipal pool that we invest in, and we invest in that because these are experts investing this money. And Georgia law is very conservative in what we can invest in, and we're just leaving it to the experts to invest our money for us. But they're earning 2.18% right now. With interest rates going up, we might earn more than that. So we feel like that we'll have a net interest cost with all these factors involved, which will be very attractive to the schools district, and quite frankly, it's a quite savvy business decision by the superintendent and administration to go this route. I'm very proud of the leadership in financial services for the credit rating, and I just want to recognize the directors Jan Hendricks and Mandy Wissing, Tom Marshall and Lisa Leach, and Debbie Randazzo, who recently retired. This achievement is an acknowledgement that leadership does matter. I also want to publicly acknowledge our financial advisor partnership with Public Financial Advisors, LLC, and our attorneys for their professional mentorship and advice in helping us to achieve these credit rating thresholds, and also through working through the complexity of a short-term note. The financial advisor team consists of Elise Lamel of the PFM Financial Advisors, LLC, and also thanks to our attorneys, Terry Finister of Murray Barnes Finister, LLP, and Clem Doyle, Gregory Doyle, Calhoun and Rogers, LLC. Mr. Chair, administration requests that the board approve board agenda item number 3, the short-term construction note resolution, so that we may proceed in requesting bids for our short-term construction notes in the U.S. financial market. Mr. Chair, that's my presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Questions? Mr. Sweeney?
Excellent presentation. I agree with all of your comments, and you might have hit on this, and if you did, I missed it, but the one thing I think that's important to cite as well is that it's the early delivery of the projects as well, because it allows us to accelerate the delivery of those projects for the students' benefits and district's benefits.
That's true.
Thank you, Mr. Sweeney. Mr. Scammahorn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was wondering on, and I don't have a particular format, but if we could get a point paper expressing what you just said and how we may not have to pay any interest or very little. My kitchen cabinet out in Northwest Cobb was asking me about the interest and the cost of the loan. And one of them threw out a figure it might cost us as much as, $500,000-$700,000 in interest. I do support, Agenda 3, but I was hard pressed to try to answer some of their questions.
Well, when I take all those factors into account, especially we're going to pay some interest costs because there used to be a spread on the interest we earned where we would actually make money on these short-term notes. But right now, with the interest rates historically low like they are, there's not as much of a spread. So we will pay interest income cost on this. Last year, it was probably in the range of $300,000 or $400,000. This year, it could be $1 million or $1.5 million, depending on, because we're borrowing more. We're borrowing for a longer period of time, and the interest rates have gone up. You might notice in the financial report I gave you, interest income in the general fund that I reported to, interest income was $486 last year, $486,000. This year we earned $1.2 million. So interest rates are going up, and that'll make the cost of the loan higher. But when you consider all those factors, and then especially if you consider the lower cost of construction costs, I think that we'll come close to breaking even with all that. Probably make a profit on it, maybe. Maybe that's not exactly the right word, but we will pay interest income costs.
So let me jump in here. So to answer your question, Mr. Skimmerhorn, we do an analysis, a very thorough analysis of, before we come to you, as I mentioned, as I introduced this item, I mentioned last year that this was going to become a standard operating procedure moving forward for SPLOST. Because, as Mr. Sweeney indicated, we get a jump start on projects. As long as we can conduct the analysis to where the cost of the loan is exceeded by the savings incurred by construction, then it's a no-brainer. Because we're getting the project started at a lower construction cost than if we waited for inflation to kick in, and then it actually costs us more money out of SPLOST to do the same project. So when we do that analysis, yes, I'm sure there's people out there that'll say, oh my gosh, you're spending $1 million to borrow money, just wait until you have it. Well, the flip side of that coin is if you wait until you have it, the inflation has kicked in on construction, so now it's actually costing you more money, which is not financially and fiscally responsible of us to proceed down that path. So once we conduct the analysis, as long as the cost of the loan is exceeded by the savings, and again, it's an estimate, but the savings we estimate to be incurred by being able to do the projects earlier, then that's when we say, okay, yes, let's go ahead with the short-term construction note. But we can get you those notes as far as what the interest is, but it's exactly what I just said. I mean, it's pretty much a no-brainer decision as long as it's an A plus B equals C. And as long as the cost of construction saved exceeds the cost of borrowing the money for 11 months in this case, then it's a go for getting the short-term construction note.
Yeah, like I said, I support, based on our initial conversations that, whatever. I'm just looking for an executive summary. I'm not looking for deep analysis or whatever, some talking points, so that 2 weeks from now, I'll have something where I can, or 3 weeks or 4 weeks or whatever, because I am over 20 and my memory is not as good as it used to be, but so that's what I'm looking for.
So, and correct me if I'm wrong, Brad, but we will be able to give you more firm numbers once the bids come in and we know exactly what the cost is. But we can give you those preliminary talking points now, and then those will be firmed up in January once the final bid comes in and we know what that bid is going to be.
Okay. Do I need to send you an email, or are we good?
No, we got it.
I'm good.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Skimmerhorn. Mr. Banks?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just for basically community consumption, in a year's time, in 2019, we will probably collect close to, say, $140 million. And $90 million is going to be an additional to that as far as expenditures that will be available during that period of time, although at the end of the year, out of that $140 million, $90 million has to be paid back. So we actually wind up with $50 million. Now, for the public to know, we're not just doing certain projects. We have many more smaller projects, if I understand correctly, that will be implemented during 2019 also. Is that correct?
I'm sure there's smaller projects.
So, you know, we're not just hoarding $50 million, because $90 million for the major projects that we've got coming up for the $90 million will probably take 2 years to complete. So, but we had to pay that $90 million back immediately, within a year's time.
I just want to be clear on the $90 million. That's not $90 million in additional money.
Right.
All it is a cash flow deal where we used to collect 11 or 12 million each month. Now what we're going to do is we're still going to collect that 11 or 12 million each month, but we're going to borrow a loan, and then with that money we collect, pay it back. So we still have the same total amount of money. We're just going to get it earlier.
Right, and I understand that. That's why I'm saying, you know, the $90 million plus we're collecting doing a monthly basis. At the end of December, we'll have $140 million that we have collected, and we have to take 90 of that and give it back, or pay back the note that we're incurring.
As we collect money during calendar year 2019, we'll probably collect more than 90 million.
Yeah,
We'll collect more than enough to pay the loan back.
Let's say it's 140 million, so you got $50 million to do other projects outside of these $90 million projects that we're anticipating doing. Is that a good understanding?
I think so.
Yes, but.
Do we say
Yeah,
that right?
I would say no, because you really have to do what's in the resolution, and that's what you're gonna do. This can change the timeline where you do those projects, though.
But if you've got, if you know you're gonna have $50 million left over after you pay the 90 million back.
That's not the way we plan. Okay,
So-
what we do is, SPLOST and finance do a cash flow analysis for the entire year.
Okay.
So let's use your number, 140 million.
Yeah.
All right. They have done an analysis of projects such that the cash flow is not going to exceed 140 million. So it's not like we're going to blow through 90 million of projects and then say, okay, we got 50 million left over. What should we do now? That cash flow has already been planned out as far as, you know, what projects are going to be implemented. And also, let's not forget that out of the $140 million estimated revenue, we have to pay back the general fund everything that's been utilized prior to SPLOST 5 revenue coming in. So like the Sprayberry Architect, whatever is expended between tonight, assuming you approve it, and January when we get the SPLOST revenue for SPLOST 5 started, the technology, the previous architects, all of that has to be repaid.
Right.
Sooner rather than later is preferable because we want to keep the general fund balance as high as possible. So that also has to come out. So it's not like we've got $140 million of projects that we can do in that first year because we have to pay back the general fund out of that $140 million.
Yeah, but my point is, we could be doing, we will be doing other projects other than these main $90 million projects. There will be other projects implemented in 2019.
Yeah, and to Clem's point, it goes by, again, the SPLOST referendum that was identified and then the notebook that
Right.
identifies those projects. So
Right.
yes,
Yeah.
many other projects
So there could
will be done.
So a lot of $3 or $4, $10 million projects that could be implemented above these current $90 million projects.
That's possible, yes.
Yeah, okay, that's what I wanted to try to get across, is that we're just not limiting to some major projects. There'll be other projects that were in the resolution that will begin in 2019 and continue in 2020 and so forth. So, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Banks. Any other questions? Consent or discussion? Discussion. Next, we have approval of the agenda. If there's no objection, our agenda is approved. And I need a motion to go into executive session to discuss personnel, land, and legal. Mr. Sweeney,
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Make a recommendation. We adjourn to executive session to discuss land, legal, and personnel matters.
Ms. Thayer's second. All in favor? Motion carries. We are adjourned to executive session and we will return at 7 o'clock.